Bullies pulled her hoodie to humiliate. She flipped them both, instantly. The harsh fluorescent lights of Lincoln High School buzzed incessantly overhead, casting their cold institutional glow across the polished linoleum floors, as Zara Novak pulled her oversized grey hoodie tighter around her thin, fragile frame. The fabric was soft from countless washings, worn thin at the elbows and cuffs, but it served as her armor against the world, a barrier between her vulnerable self and the hostile environment that surrounded her every day. Her dark hair, thick and straight as silk, fell like a protective curtain across her angular face, carefully obscuring the sharp intelligence that flickered in her deep brown eyes as she navigated the crowded, chaotic hallway with the practiced precision of someone who had learned to become invisible. Students rushed past her in tight-knit clusters, their voices rising and falling in animated conversations that echoed off the sterile walls and metal lockers, their laughter bouncing around the space like ricocheting bullets. Their designer backpacks and trendy clothes spoke of confidence and belonging, things that felt as foreign to Zara as a distant language. None of them acknowledged her presence as she moved through their midst like a ghost, her head down, her footsteps silent and careful. She had convinced herself that she preferred it this way, the anonymity, the isolation, the safety of being overlooked. But deep in her heart, she knew it was a lie she told herself to make the loneliness bearable. Zara had transferred to Lincoln High exactly 3 months, 2 weeks and 4 days ago, when her father's engineering job had relocated their small, fractured family from the familiar streets of Chicago to this mid-sized town in the heart of Ohio. The adjustment had been more difficult than she had ever imagined it could be, made infinitely worse by her naturally quiet, introspective demeanor, and the fact that she stood barely 5 feet tall, with a delicate frame that seemed to disappear entirely inside her deliberately baggy clothes. Her accent, still tinged with the melodic traces of her Babcia's Polish heritage that her mother had carefully preserved and passed down, made her stand out even more among her American-born classmates who had never ventured beyond the county lines. The move had come at the worst possible time, just as Zara was beginning to heal from the trauma that had shattered her world 2 years ago. Starting over in a new place, surrounded by strangers who knew nothing of her history or her pain, had reopened wounds she thought were finally beginning to close. Every morning was a battle just to get out of bed, to put on her armor of anonymity, and face another day of being the outsider, the damaged girl, the one who didn't belong. She clutched her worn backpack straps with white knuckles and quickened her pace toward her locker, hoping desperately to avoid any unwanted attention that might shatter the carefully constructed invisibility she had worked so hard to maintain. The morning routine had become a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance, her movements timed to the minute to miss the groups of popular students who seemed to find endless entertainment in her obvious discomfort and social awkwardness. She had memorized their schedules, their hangout spots, their patterns of movement through the school like a prey animal studying predators. "Well, well, look what crawled out of the shadows," a voice boomed behind her, loud enough to cut through the general hallway noise and make several nearby students turn their heads. Zara's stomach dropped like a stone, the familiar sensation of dread washing over her in cold waves. She recognized that voice immediately. The cocky drawl, the underlying cruelty, the casual confidence that came from never having been challenged. Trevor Matthews, the unofficial king of Lincoln High's rigid social hierarchy, the golden boy who ruled the school with an iron fist wrapped in a Letterman jacket. At 6 feet tall, with perfectly styled blonde hair that looked like it belonged in a shampoo commercial, and the kind of confident swagger that came from years of being the star quarterback, Trevor commanded attention and respect wherever he went. His Letterman jacket hung perfectly on his broad shoulders like it had been tailored specifically for him, and his piercing blue eyes held a cruel glint that Zara had learned to fear with every fiber of her being. She didn't turn around, instead focusing all her attention on the combination lock of her dented metal locker, her fingers trembling as she tried to remember the numbers that suddenly seemed to have vanished from her memory. Maybe if she ignored him completely, maybe if she pretended she hadn't heard him, he would grow bored and move on to someone else, some other victim who would provide him with the entertainment he craved. But her hands shook uncontrollably as she spun the dial, the numbers blurring together through the tears that threatened to spill from her eyes, and she could feel his presence behind her like a storm cloud gathering strength. "I'm talking to you, ghost girl," Trevor said, his voice much closer now, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne and feel the heat radiating from his body. His friend Jake Williams snickered beside him like a hyena, a tall, lanky boy with gangly limbs who served as Trevor's eager accomplice in most of his cruel schemes. Jake's red hair was buzzed into a military-style cut that emphasized his prominent ears, and his freckled face always seemed to wear a mocking expression, as if the entire world was one big joke that only he understood. The nickname Ghost Girl had started during her second week at Lincoln High, when a teacher had marked her absent despite her being present in class, sitting quietly in the back corner where she always positioned herself. Trevor had latched onto the incident like a parasite, using it as ammunition in his ongoing campaign to make her life miserable. The name had stuck, spreading through the school's social networks like a virus, until even students who didn't know her real name referred to her as the Ghost. Zara finally managed to coax her locker open with shaking fingers, but before she could grab her heavy textbooks and escape to the relative safety of her first period classroom, Trevor's large hand slammed the metal door shut with a loud, violent bang that echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. The sound was so sudden and forceful that several students turned to look, their conversations faltering as they sensed the potential for drama. But none of them moved to help, none of them spoke up or intervened. They had all learned long ago that getting involved in Trevor's games only made you his next target, that the safest course of action was to watch from the sidelines and be grateful it wasn't happening to them. "You know, it's incredibly rude to ignore people when they're talking to you," Trevor said with mock politeness, positioning his imposing frame directly in front of her locker so that she couldn't escape. His height forced Zara to crane her neck back to look up at him, a physical reminder of the power dynamic between them, the way he towered over her like a giant looking down at an ant. "Didn't your parents teach you any manners, or were they too busy feeling sorry for themselves?" The casual cruelty of the comment, the way he so effortlessly found her most vulnerable spots and pressed on them like infected wounds, made Zara's breath catch in her throat. Her parents, or rather her parent, since her mother was gone forever, was a topic too painful to discuss, too raw to expose to someone like Trevor, who would use her grief as entertainment. "I'm sorry," Zara whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the bustling hallway, so quiet that Trevor had to lean in closer to hear her. "I didn't hear you." It was a lie, of course. She had heard him perfectly clearly, had recognized his voice the moment he spoke, but admitting that would only make things worse. Everything made things worse when it came to Trevor Matthews. Jake laughed, a harsh, grating sound that reminded Zara of nails on a chalkboard, making her flinch involuntarily. "She didn't hear you, Trevor. Maybe we need to speak louder so the little mouse can understand us." "Yeah, maybe we do," Trevor agreed with theatrical enthusiasm, his voice rising dramatically as he prepared to put on a show for their growing audience. "Hey everyone, look at Ghost Girl. She's so tiny and pathetic, she needs help reaching her locker. Maybe we should get her a step stool." The hallway fell into an uncomfortable silence for a moment as students turned to stare, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they focused their attention on the unfolding spectacle. Zara felt heat rise in her cheeks, a burning flush of shame and humiliation that spread across her face like wildfire as dozens of curious eyes focused on her small form. She tried desperately to shrink further into her protective hoodie, to disappear entirely if possible, but there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run, no escape from the spotlight of their collective judgment. The attention felt like being stripped naked in front of a crowd, exposed and vulnerable in the most fundamental way. Some of the watching students wore expressions of curiosity, others showed thinly veiled amusement, and a few looked uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. It was exactly the kind of public humiliation that Trevor specialized in, the type of calculated cruelty that would follow her for weeks or months, becoming part of her reputation, part of how people saw her. "Leave her alone, Trevor," a clear, strong voice called out from across the hall, cutting through the tension like a knife. Zara's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the voice of Marcus Chen, a student from her AP literature class who occupied a completely different social stratosphere than she did. Marcus was everything she wasn't: tall, confident, effortlessly popular, the kind of person who moved through the world as if he belonged everywhere he went. His dark hair was always perfectly styled, without looking like he tried too hard, and his warm brown eyes seemed to see through people's facades to something deeper and more authentic underneath. He was also one of the few students who had ever shown her any genuine kindness, offering to share his detailed notes when she had missed class with a particularly bad cold, asking her opinion on discussion questions in literature class, treating her like a real person instead of a curiosity or an object of pity. The fact that someone like Marcus even knew her name, let alone was willing to defend her publicly, sent a confusing mixture of gratitude and terror coursing through her veins. She was grateful for his intervention, but terrified of what it might cost him, what it might cost both of them. Trevor's expression darkened like a storm cloud as he turned toward Marcus, his blue eyes flashing with anger and challenge. "Oh, look who's playing White Knight. What's it to you, Chen? You got a thing for damaged goods." The insult hit Zara like a physical blow, the casual way he reduced her to nothing more than broken merchandise, something defective and worthless. But Marcus didn't flinch, didn't back down from Trevor's intimidating presence. Marcus stepped closer, his jaw set with quiet determination, his posture radiating a calm confidence that made him seem larger than his actual size. "It's called basic human decency, Trevor. You should try it sometime instead of being a walking advertisement for why some people shouldn't be allowed to breed." The tension in the hallway became thick enough to cut with a knife, electric and dangerous. Students formed a loose circle around the confrontation, sensing the potential for drama, for violence, for something that would give them stories to tell for weeks. Phones appeared in hands, ready to record whatever happened next for posterity and social media immortality. Zara felt sick to her stomach, knowing with absolute certainty that her problems had now become Marcus's problems, that her mere existence had dragged someone good and kind into Trevor's crosshairs. "You know what?" Trevor said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level that somehow seemed more threatening than his earlier shouting. "I think Ghost Girl here needs to learn what happens when she gets other people involved in her pathetic business. Maybe it's time everyone saw what she's really been hiding under that hood." Before Zara could react, before she could run or defend herself or even process what was happening, Trevor grabbed the hood of her sweatshirt with his large hands and yanked it back hard, the sudden violent motion jerking her backward with surprising force. She stumbled, her equilibrium completely destroyed, her worn backpack falling to the floor with a loud thud that seemed to echo forever. Books scattered across the polished linoleum in every direction, her carefully organized notebooks, her textbooks with their protective covers, her pens and pencils rolling away like escaping prisoners, and her meticulously organized notes flew everywhere like confetti, pages separating and mixing together in a chaotic mess that would take hours to sort out. But the scattered belongings weren't the worst part, weren't what made the hallway erupt in sharp gasps and whispered exclamations of shock and morbid fascination. When Trevor pulled her hood back with such brutal force, he exposed what Zara had been desperately hiding underneath for months, a large, jagged scar that ran from her left temple down to her jawline like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. The scar was a pale, raised line against her olive skin, roughly textured and impossible to miss. A permanent reminder of the worst night of her life, the night when everything she had known and loved was ripped away in a matter of seconds. The hallway erupted in a symphony of shocked gasps, excited whispers, and barely contained reactions. Students who had been watching with mild, detached interest now stared with open shock and morbid curiosity, their eyes wide and hungry for details, for explanations, for the story behind such obvious trauma. Zara heard fragments of their conversations floating through the air like poison. "Oh my God, did you see that? What the hell happened to her face? No wonder she always wears that hoodie. She looks like something out of a horror movie. That's so gross, I can't even look at it." Each whispered comment was like a knife twisted in her chest, confirmation of every fear she had carried since the accident, every nightmare about people's reactions, every reason she had for hiding herself away from the world. The scar represented not just physical damage, but emotional devastation, the loss of her mother, the destruction of her family, the end of everything she had been before that terrible night. Zara's vision blurred with tears of humiliation and rage as she frantically tried to pull her hood back up to restore the protective barrier between herself and their staring eyes. But Trevor wasn't finished with his performance. He grabbed her thin wrist with his strong fingers, preventing her from covering herself, holding her in place like a specimen in a display case. "Well, well," he said loudly, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly hushed hallway, ensuring that everyone present could hear every cruel word. "No wonder you hide under that thing like some kind of cave creature. You look like something that crawled out of a horror movie, like Frankenstein's monster had a baby with a car wreck." Jake cackled with genuine delight at Trevor's creativity, and several other students joined in with nervous laughter, the kind of uncomfortable sound people make when they know they're witnessing something wrong, but don't have the courage to stop it. The sound of their amusement was like knives in Zara's chest, each laugh a confirmation that she was exactly what she had always feared, a freak, a monster, something to be mocked and avoided. She had spent months building up the courage to attend this school, weeks practicing normal interactions in front of her bedroom mirror, days preparing herself mentally for the possibility of making friends, of starting over, of being normal again. And now her worst nightmare was coming true in the most public way possible, in front of dozens of witnesses who would spread the story throughout the school like wildfire. "That's enough," Marcus said firmly, his voice cutting through the laughter like a blade as he stepped between Trevor and Zara, using his body as a shield. "Back off, man. You've made your point." Trevor's eyes flashed with fury at being challenged so directly, so publicly. "Or what? You'll make me? You going to fight me over your broken girlfriend?" "If I have to," Marcus replied without hesitation, his stance shifting subtly into something more defensive, more ready for confrontation. The standoff lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity to Zara, suspended in that moment between violence and resolution, between escalation and retreat. She could see the calculations happening behind Trevor's eyes, weighing the social cost of backing down against the potential consequences of actual violence in front of so many witnesses. Finally, Trevor released her wrist with a theatrical gesture and stepped back, a cruel smile spreading across his handsome features like oil on water. "This isn't over, Chen," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, making sure the threat was public and unmistakable. "And you," he pointed directly at Zara with one accusing finger. "Next time think twice before getting your boyfriend involved in your problems. Some of us have better things to do than babysit freaks." With that final insult, Trevor and Jake walked away with exaggerated swagger, their performance complete, leaving Zara to collect her scattered belongings while trying to ignore the continued stares and whispers of her classmates. The circle of spectators began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, like vultures leaving a carcass, but she could feel their eyes on her, could hear the excited conversations beginning as they processed what they had witnessed. Marcus immediately knelt down beside her to help gather her scattered books and papers, his expression filled with genuine concern and something that might have been admiration. His hands were gentle as he collected her notes, careful not to crumple or damage them further. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his voice soft and private in contrast to the public spectacle that had just unfolded. Zara nodded quickly, not trusting her voice, not wanting him to hear how badly she was shaking inside. She pulled her hood back up with trembling hands and stuffed her books into her backpack with sharp, jerky movements, desperate to escape before her carefully maintained composure cracked completely. "Hey," Marcus said gently, his tone so kind it almost broke her heart. "Don't let them get to you. Trevor's just a coward who picks on people to make himself feel better about his own pathetic life." For a moment, Zara looked up at him directly, and Marcus saw something in her dark eyes that made him pause, something that seemed almost dangerous lurking beneath the hurt and fear. It was there for just an instant, a flash of something wild and fierce and utterly unexpected, before she looked away again. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, then hurried away down the hallway before he could respond, before she could say something she would regret, before the mask she wore could slip any further. The rest of that endless day passed in a blur of humiliation and whispered conversations that followed her from class to class, like a shadow. Word of the hallway incident spread quickly through the school's social networks with the speed and efficiency of a virus, transmitted through text messages, social media posts, and excited retellings that grew more dramatic with each iteration. Zara found herself the unwilling subject of stares and whispers wherever she went, the center of attention in the worst possible way. Some students looked at her with obvious pity, their expressions soft and sympathetic, in a way that made her feel like a wounded animal in a zoo. Others watched her with undisguised curiosity, studying her scar with the fascination of people examining a traffic accident. And a disturbing few, looked at her with barely concealed disgust, as if her very presence somehow contaminated their perfect world. In her chemistry class, someone had taken the time to write FREAK in large, bold letters across her assigned lab table with permanent marker, the word standing out starkly against the black surface like a brand. The teacher either didn't notice or chose not to address it, leaving Zara to sit and stare at the cruel graffiti for the entire 50-minute period while trying to focus on molecular structures and chemical equations. During lunch, she sat alone in the far corner of the massive cafeteria, picking at her sandwich without appetite while trying to ignore the groups of students who would glance her way and then lean in to whisper excitedly to their friends. The conversations would stop when she looked in their direction, only to resume the moment she looked away, and she could feel the weight of their judgment like a physical presence pressing down on her shoulders. But perhaps the worst part of the entire ordeal was seeing Marcus in the hallway between classes. He tried repeatedly to catch her eye, probably wanting to check on her welfare, to offer more support or comfort, but Zara couldn't bear to face him. She had brought him into her mess, had made him a target of Trevor's anger, and now he would probably suffer the consequences of associating with the school freak. The guilt and shame were almost overwhelming. That evening, Zara sat in her small bedroom in the modest house her father had rented on the outskirts of town, staring at her reflection in the antique mirror that had belonged to her mother. The scar stood out starkly against her pale skin in the harsh overhead lighting, a permanent reminder of the night that had changed everything, the moment when her world had been torn apart by screaming metal and shattering glass, and the horrible silence that followed. She traced the raised line with one trembling finger, remembering with perfect clarity the screech of tires on wet asphalt, the sound of glass exploding like a bomb, the way time had seemed to slow down as their car spun out of control, and the eternal moment of impact when everything she had known and loved was destroyed in an instant. The scar was more than just damaged tissue. It was a map of her trauma, a physical manifestation of loss and pain and survivor's guilt that no amount of makeup or clothing could fully hide. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, the sound making her jump in the quiet room. "Nice face, freak. Can't wait to see what other surprises you're hiding under those baggy clothes." The message hit her like a punch to the stomach, crude and threatening in a way that made her feel sick and violated. She deleted it immediately, but 3 more appeared within minutes, each one more vicious than the last. Then 5 more arrived in quick succession, followed by a steady stream of anonymous harassment that showed no signs of stopping. Someone had gotten her phone number from somewhere, probably the school directory or a leaked contact list, and shared it with others, and now the torment was following her home, invading the one space where she should have felt safe. The messages ranged from crude comments about her appearance to graphic descriptions of violence, each one designed to hurt and intimidate. She turned off her phone with shaking hands and walked to her closet, pushing aside the hanging clothes that made up her carefully curated wardrobe of anonymity to reveal a large black duffel bag hidden in the back corner like a secret. With trembling fingers, she unzipped the bag and stared at the contents. A collection of martial arts uniforms in various sizes, trophies and medals that caught the light and sparkled like forgotten dreams, and photographs that told a story she had never shared with anyone at Lincoln High, a story of who she used to be before the accident changed everything. Before the crash, before the scar, before the crushing depression that had followed her mother's death like a hungry shadow, Zara had been a completely different person. She had been a national champion in mixed martial arts, trained from the age of 5 by her father, Stanisław, who had been a professional fighter in Poland before immigrating to America in search of better opportunities for his family. She had been confident, fierce, and seemingly unafraid of anything the world could throw at her. The trophies in the bag told the story of years of dedication and triumph, regional championships, national tournaments, international competitions where she had represented her country with pride. She had been featured in martial arts magazines, had appeared in local news stories, had been on track for Olympic consideration before everything fell apart. But after the accident, after months of surgeries and physical therapy and psychological counseling, after watching her father struggle to hold their fractured family together while drowning in medical bills and grief, Zara had walked away from it all. She had packed away her uniforms, ignored her coach's increasingly desperate phone calls, and chosen to become invisible instead of invincible, small instead of strong. The transformation had been gradual, but complete. The confident fighter had been replaced by a timid ghost, the girl who had once faced down opponents twice her size, now trembling at the thought of making eye contact with classmates. The accident hadn't just given her a scar. It had stolen her identity, her sense of self, her belief that she could face whatever challenges life presented. The next morning brought fresh horrors that made the previous day's humiliation seem almost gentle by comparison. Someone, probably multiple someones, had printed out dozens of copies of her scarred face from social media, images that had been captured during yesterday's confrontation and shared online without her knowledge or consent. The photos were grainy and distorted, the harsh lighting making her look even more damaged and monstrous than she felt, like something from a medical textbook or a horror movie. These printed images had been taped to her locker, her desk in homeroom, the bathroom mirrors, and seemingly every available surface throughout the school. Students gathered around each display like art gallery visitors, pointing and laughing and taking selfies with the images as if they were tourist attractions. The violation felt complete and absolute. Her most private pain had been turned into public entertainment. Zara had to push through crowds of amused spectators just to reach her locker, their laughter and comments following her like a toxic cloud. The hallway that had once been merely uncomfortable was now openly hostile, filled with pointing fingers and cruel smiles, and the constant flash of phone cameras documenting her humiliation for posterity. "Hey, Scarface!" Jake called out as she walked past a group of his friends, his voice carrying clearly through the hallway noise. "Halloween's not for another 6 months, but I appreciate the year-round commitment to the costume." The comment earned him a round of appreciative laughter from his audience, and Zara felt her face burn with shame and anger. The nickname Scarface, a reference to both her disfigurement and the violent movie, had apparently replaced Ghost Girl overnight, spreading through the school's social ecosystem with viral efficiency. Trevor appeared at her side as if summoned by her distress, his imposing presence looming over her like a storm cloud gathering strength. "You know, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," he said with mock thoughtfulness, his voice loud enough to attract attention from nearby students. "I don't think you learned your lesson about knowing your place in the world." Zara kept walking, clutching her books to her chest like a shield, her head down and her steps quick and purposeful. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in front of her, filled with hostile faces and cruel laughter, like running a gauntlet of judgment and mockery. "I'm talking to you," Trevor said more forcefully, his large hand closing around her shoulder and spinning her around to face him with enough force to make her stumble. "When someone's trying to help you understand your position in the social hierarchy, you should pay attention and show some gratitude." "Please," Zara whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the crowded hallway. "I just want to go to class and be left alone." "Oh, she speaks," Jake said mockingly, his freckled face twisted into an expression of exaggerated surprise. "What's wrong, Scarface? Don't like being the center of attention? I thought freaks like you craved the spotlight." Trevor's hand moved slowly toward her hood, and Zara's entire body tensed like a coiled spring. Every muscle, every nerve, every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something other than stand there and endure another round of public humiliation. She couldn't go through yesterday's nightmare again. Not in front of all these people, not when the images were already plastered all over school. "Don't," she said, her voice slightly stronger than before, carrying a note of warning that made Trevor pause for just a moment. "Don't what?" Trevor asked with theatrical confusion, his fingers gripping the fabric of her hood like a predator toying with its prey. "Don't do this." Without warning, he yanked her hood back again with even more force than the day before, exposing her scar to the gathered crowd like a ringmaster revealing the star attraction of a freak show. This time, however, Zara didn't stumble or fall or react with the helpless shock that had characterized her previous response. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed on Trevor's face with an intensity that was almost unsettling, like a wild animal calculating the distance to its prey. "There she is," Trevor announced to his audience with the flourish of a showman, trying to maintain his confident tone despite the slight unease he felt under her unwavering stare. "The real you, not hiding behind fabric and shadows. Why don't you tell everyone the story of how you got that beautiful scar? I'm sure it's fascinating." The words hit Zara like physical blows, each syllable carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. The scar represented the absolute worst night of her life, the moment when everything she had known and loved was ripped away in a symphony of twisted metal and broken glass. For Trevor to mock it so casually, to use her deepest trauma as entertainment for his audience, was more than her battered psyche could bear. But something fundamental was shifting inside her, like tectonic plates moving deep beneath the Earth's surface. The fear and shame that had dominated her thoughts and actions for months began to recede, replaced by something that felt like molten steel flowing through her veins. She remembered her father's voice during training sessions that now seemed like they belonged to someone else's life. When your opponent underestimates you, Mały Wojownik, that is when you possess the greatest advantage. Little warrior, that's what he used to call her. You want to know how I got it? Zara asked, her voice carrying through the suddenly quiet hallway with unexpected clarity and strength. Trevor nodded eagerly, sensing victory, anticipating the breakdown that would complete his dominance over her. Yeah, I think we'd all like to hear the tragic backstory. Car accident, Zara said simply, her voice steady and matter-of-fact. 2 years ago, drunk driver ran a red light and hit us head-on. My mother died instantly, and I spent 3 months in the hospital learning how to walk again. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their excitement suddenly dampened by the brutal honesty of her response. This wasn't the entertainment they had expected. This was real trauma, real loss, real pain that couldn't be laughed away or dismissed. Even Trevor seemed taken aback by her directness, by the way she had stripped away the mystery and revealed the stark reality underneath. But you know what the interesting thing is, Zara continued, taking a step closer to Trevor, her posture subtly changing in ways that most people wouldn't notice, but that sent warning signals to anyone who knew how to read body language. The accident didn't just give me this scar, it also taught me that there are much worse things in this world than being hurt, like being the kind of person who hurts others for entertainment. Trevor's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment, his carefully constructed image of confident dominance beginning to crack under the pressure of her unexpected resistance. Are you calling me a... I'm not calling you anything, Zara interrupted, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of something dangerous. I'm just saying that if you think a scar makes someone weak, you might want to reconsider your definition of strength. The hallway had fallen into complete silence now, the usual chaos of student conversations and locker slams replaced by a tense stillness that seemed to vibrate with potential energy. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz more quietly, as if the entire building was holding its breath. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Trevor's hand hovered in the air between them, his anger fighting against confusion, and a growing sense that something had fundamentally changed in the dynamic between them. Finally, his rage exploded like a dam bursting. "You little freak," he snarled, his voice thick with fury and humiliation, raising his hand as if to strike her across the face. "I'll show you what strength really looks like." But Zara was ready. Without conscious thought, her body moved into a defensive stance that was as natural as breathing, her weight shifting to the balls of her feet, her hands coming up in a guard position that spoke of years of training and muscle memory that no amount of trauma could completely erase. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The timid, frightened girl was gone, replaced by someone who knew exactly how dangerous she could be. Trevor's hand stopped mid-swing, confusion replacing anger on his face as primitive survival instincts warned him that something was very, very wrong. Something in Zara's posture, in the way she held herself, in the calculating look in her dark eyes, sent alarm bells ringing in the deepest parts of his brain. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice uncertain for the first time since Zara had known him. The moment stretched between them, electric with tension and the promise of violence, like the calm before a storm. The gathered students sensed the shift, the way the predator-prey dynamic had suddenly become much more complicated, much more dangerous. Phone cameras focused and recording lights blinked as everyone prepared to document whatever happened next. Then the bell rang, its harsh electronic sound cutting through the tension like a knife, and the spell was broken. Students began moving toward their classes with reluctant steps, the show apparently over, at least for now. Trevor lowered his hand slowly, his face still twisted with confusion and rage, but some deeper instinct warning him against pushing this confrontation any further. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence, carrying instead a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Yes, it is," Zara replied quietly, her voice carrying a finality that made several nearby students pause and look back. "And deep down, you know it." She adjusted her hood, gathered her scattered dignity, and walked away with measured steps, leaving Trevor standing in the emptying hallway with a growing sense that the social order he had worked so hard to establish was beginning to crumble around him. The rest of that week passed in a strange, tense calm that felt like the eye of a hurricane, deceptively peaceful but charged with the promise of greater storms to come. Trevor and Jake continued their campaign of harassment, but there was something different about it now, something more desperate and less confident. They seemed to be testing her, probing for weaknesses, trying to find the frightened girl who had been their easy target just days before. But that girl was gone, or at least deeply buried under layers of rediscovered strength and purpose. Zara no longer flinched at their words, no longer hunched her shoulders when they approached, no longer allowed their cruelty to define her day. She had remembered who she used to be, and that knowledge was like armor against their increasingly frantic attacks. She also began to notice that Marcus had been watching her more carefully, studying her with intelligent eyes that seemed to see through the carefully constructed facade she presented to the world. He would nod when he saw her in the hallway, and once he even smiled when she helped answer a particularly difficult question in their shared literature class. The attention both thrilled and terrified her. Thrilled because it represented the possibility of genuine connection, terrified because she wasn't sure she was ready to let anyone see the real her. On Thursday afternoon, as autumn shadows grew long across the student parking lot, Zara was walking to her father's old Honda Civic when she heard raised voices cutting through the late afternoon air. She recognized Marcus's voice immediately, and her stomach dropped when she realized he was arguing with Trevor in what sounded like an increasingly heated confrontation. "You need to leave her alone," Marcus was saying, his voice tight with controlled anger. "She's been through enough trauma without you adding to it." "Oh, I get it now," Trevor replied with cruel amusement, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "You think you're going to be her hero, her knight in shining armor. You think you're going to save the damaged goods and make her fall in love with you like some kind of romantic movie." "It's not like that," Marcus said, but Zara could hear the frustration building in his voice, the way his calm was beginning to crack under Trevor's relentless provocation. "She's a human being, Trevor. She deserves to be treated with basic respect and dignity." "Respect?" Trevor laughed harshly, the sound echoing off the cars and concrete. "She's a freak who hides in oversized hoodies and won't even look people in the eye. She skulks around the halls like some kind of damaged ghost. What exactly is respectable about that pathetic existence?" Zara crept closer, staying hidden behind a row of parked cars, her heart pounding as she watched the confrontation unfold. She could see Marcus standing next to his blue Honda, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his face flushed with anger and frustration. Trevor and Jake flanked him like wolves circling prey, their body language aggressive and threatening, clearly enjoying the way they had managed to get under his skin. "You know what I think?" Trevor continued, his voice taking on a more dangerous edge. "I think you're just as pathetic as she is. Maybe you two freaks deserve each other. Maybe I should arrange a play date." "Maybe we do deserve each other," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a note of defiance that made Zara's heart skip a beat. The words hit her like a physical blow, but not in the way Trevor intended. Marcus, kind, popular, perfect Marcus, who could have anyone he wanted, had just aligned himself with her publicly, in front of the school's biggest bully, knowing full well what it might cost him. The gesture was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, a declaration of solidarity that she had never expected and wasn't sure she deserved. Trevor's expression darkened like a storm cloud. his blue eyes flashing with genuine anger at being defied so directly. "Wrong answer, Chen." What happened next unfolded in slow motion, like a scene from a movie played at half speed. Trevor stepped forward and shoved Marcus hard with both hands, using his size advantage to send the smaller boy stumbling backward into his car with a metallic thud that echoed across the parking lot. Jake moved to flank him from the other side, cutting off any escape route, and Zara realized with growing horror that they were about to beat up the one person who had shown her genuine kindness. The thought was unbearable. She couldn't let that happen, couldn't allow Marcus to suffer because of her problems, because of his decision to defend someone like her. The guilt would destroy what little peace she had managed to find. Without thinking, without planning, without considering the consequences, Zara stepped out from behind the cars that had hidden her. "Stop!" she called out, her voice carrying across the parking lot with unexpected authority. All three boys turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from surprise to cruel anticipation. Trevor's face broke into a wide, predatory smile that reminded her of a shark sensing blood in the water. "Well, well," he said with theatrical delight, spreading his arms wide as if welcoming an old friend. "Look who decided to join the party. Perfect timing, Scarface. You can watch your boyfriend get exactly what's coming to him." "He's not my boyfriend," Zara said calmly, walking closer with measured steps, her posture straight and confident in a way that made Trevor's smile falter slightly. "And you're not going to touch him?" Trevor laughed, but there was something forced about it now, something that didn't quite ring true. "Oh, really? And what exactly are you going to do about it, freak? Hide behind your hood some more? Run crying to a teacher? Face the facts? You're nothing. You're weak, you're ugly, and you're completely powerless to stop anything that happens here." Instead of answering with words, Zara reached up with steady hands and pulled her hood down, exposing her scar to the afternoon sunlight without shame or hesitation. This time, she didn't try to hide behind her hair or duck her head or make herself smaller. She stood straight, her shoulders back, and looked Trevor directly in the eye with an intensity that made him unconsciously take a step backward. "I'm going to ask you one more time," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the parking lot like a blade through silk. "Leave him alone." "Or what?" Trevor sneered, but his voice lacked its usual confidence, carrying instead a note of uncertainty that he couldn't quite hide. "You'll cry at me? Run to the principal? Face it, Scarface. You're nothing. You're weak, you're damaged, and you're completely—" Trevor never finished his sentence. In one fluid motion that spoke of years of training and muscle memory that no amount of trauma could completely erase, Zara closed the distance between them and grabbed his wrist, twisting it behind his back with a speed and precision that shocked everyone watching. Trevor cried out in pain and surprise as he found himself face down on the hood of a nearby car, his arm bent at an angle that spoke of serious discomfort without quite crossing the line into actual injury. "Let me go," he shouted, struggling against her grip with increasing desperation, but finding that every movement only increased his discomfort. "The thing about scars," Zara said calmly, applying just enough pressure to keep him still without causing permanent damage, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence that had fallen over the parking lot, "is that they don't make you weak. They make you remember what you survived." Jake stood frozen, his mouth hanging open like a fish out of water, clearly unable to process what he was seeing. Marcus stared in amazement as this quiet, shy girl who barely spoke in class completely controlled the school's biggest bully with apparent ease, making it look as simple as restraining a misbehaving child. "You want to know what I survived?" Zara continued, her voice taking on a harder edge, years of pain and rage finally finding their voice. "I survived watching my mother die in front of me. I survived 3 months in the hospital learning how to walk again. I survived skin grafts and physical therapy and psychological counseling. I survived depression so deep I didn't want to get out of bed for 6 months. I survived losing everything I thought I was and having to rebuild myself from nothing. And you know what? After all that, dealing with a pathetic bully like you is absolutely nothing." She released Trevor's wrist and stepped back, her movements controlled and precise. He spun around immediately, his face red with rage and humiliation, his carefully constructed image of invincibility shattered in front of witnesses who would spread the story throughout the school within hours. "You bitch!" he screamed, his voice cracking with fury and embarrassment, lunging toward her with all the grace and strategy of an enraged animal. What happened next was like watching a master craftsman at work, someone who had trained for years to turn violence into art. Zara sidestepped Trevor's clumsy, emotion-driven attack with minimal effort, grabbed his extended arm, and used his own momentum to flip him over her hip in a perfect hip toss that sent him crashing to the asphalt with a sound that echoed across the parking lot. He landed hard on his back, the wind knocked out of him, his Letterman jacket torn and dirty. Jake, seeing his leader defeated so thoroughly, charged at Zara from the side with more enthusiasm than skill, clearly hoping to overwhelm her through sheer aggression. She spun to face him with fluid grace, her movements economical and precise, and when he reached for her with grasping hands, she caught his wrist, pivoted on one foot, and swept his legs out from under him with a technique that spoke of years of practice. He hit the ground next to Trevor with a painful thud that made several watching students wince in sympathy. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds from start to finish. Zara stood over both boys, breathing calmly while they groaned and struggled to get their bearings, like a lion standing over fallen prey. A crowd had gathered, students streaming out of the school building and nearby cars to see what the commotion was about, their phones out and recording everything for posterity and social media immortality. The video would be shared thousands of times within hours, spreading far beyond the boundaries of Lincoln High School. "The next time you want to pick on someone," Zara said loudly, ensuring that everyone present could hear her words clearly, "make sure you know who you're dealing with. Make sure you understand that some people have been through hell and came back stronger." Trevor managed to sit up slowly, his face twisted with pain and humiliation that cut deeper than any physical injury. His perfect hair was disheveled, his jacket was torn, and there was a scrape on his cheek where he had hit the asphalt. "You'll pay for this," he gasped, his voice weak and thready. "No," Zara said simply, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I won't, because you're not going to bother me anymore. You're not going to bother Marcus, and you're not going to bother anyone else either." "You can't," Trevor started to protest, but Zara cut him off with a look that made him fall silent. "I can," she said quietly. "Want to know why? Because I'm not afraid of you anymore. I'm not afraid of anyone. And once word gets out about what happened here today, nobody else will be afraid of you either. Your reign of terror is over." She was absolutely right, and everyone present knew it. The video of the fight was already being uploaded to social media platforms, tagged and shared and commented on by dozens of accounts. Students who had watched Trevor terrorize others for years were seeing him humiliated by a girl half his size, his image of invincibility shattered beyond repair. Trevor finally managed to stand, leaning heavily on a nearby car for support, his movements slow and pained. His Letterman jacket hung askew on his shoulders, and there was grass in his perfectly styled hair. The transformation from confident bully to defeated victim was so complete, it was almost pitiful. "This isn't over," he said weakly, but the words carried no conviction, no threat, no power. "Yes, it is," Zara replied with finality that made several nearby students pause and stare. "And deep down, you know it?" She turned to Marcus, who was still staring at her with a mixture of amazement and something that might have been admiration. "Are you okay?" He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'm fine, But you, where did you learn to do that? Long story, Zara said, pulling her hood back up with hands that barely trembled. Maybe I'll tell you sometime. As the crowd began to disperse with reluctant steps, still buzzing with excitement and disbelief, Zara walked toward her car with measured steps. She could feel the stares of her classmates following her, but they were different now. Instead of pity or mockery or disgusted curiosity, she saw something that looked suspiciously like respect, like admiration, like the recognition that she was someone to be taken seriously. "Zara," Marcus called out, jogging to catch up with her before she could escape. "Wait!" She turned to face him, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the physical confrontation she had just survived. After everything that had happened, she wasn't sure she was ready for whatever conversation was about to unfold. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying a sincerity that made her chest tight. "For standing up for me. Nobody's ever done that before." "You stood up for me first," Zara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the hallway that day, and again today. You didn't have to, but you did." Marcus smiled, and Zara felt something warm and unexpected unfurl in her chest like a flower blooming in spring. "Maybe we could get coffee sometime. I'd really like to hear that long story you mentioned." For the first time in months, Zara smiled back, genuinely smiled, not the careful, practiced expression she used to deflect attention, but a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. "I'd like that too." The following Monday morning, Lincoln High School felt like a completely different place, as if the building itself had undergone some fundamental transformation over the weekend. The video of Zara's confrontation with Trevor had gone viral, not just within the school, but throughout the district and beyond, shared and reshared until it had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times by people who had never heard of Lincoln High School, but who recognized the universal story of a victim fighting back against their oppressor. Students who had been terrorized by Trevor for years were suddenly walking taller, speaking louder, taking up space in ways they never had before. They knew that their tormentor had been brought low by someone they had dismissed as weak, that the social order that had seemed so permanent and unchangeable was actually fragile and could be overturned by a single act of courage. Trevor himself was a shadow of his former self, his transformation so complete it was almost difficult to believe. He still came to school, but the swagger was gone, replaced by hunched shoulders and downcast eyes. He kept his head down, avoided eye contact, and spoke to no one unless spoken to first. The Letterman jacket that had once been a symbol of his dominance now seemed to hang on him like a costume that no longer fit. Jake had transferred to a different school over the weekend, unable to face the humiliation of being defeated so thoroughly by someone he had tormented. His absence was barely noticed. Without Trevor's protection and encouragement, he had been revealed as nothing more than a cruel follower, with no power of his own. Zara, meanwhile, had undergone her own transformation, but hers was more subtle, more internal. She still wore her hoodie, but she no longer hid behind it like armor. She made eye contact when people spoke to her, participated actively in class discussions, and even joined the martial arts club that Marcus had enthusiastically suggested she start. The response had been overwhelming. Dozens of students had signed up, many of them former victims of bullying who wanted to learn how to defend themselves. The scar was still there, of course, still visible when her hood was down, still a permanent reminder of the worst night of her life. But it no longer defined her or controlled her actions. Instead, it had become simply part of her story, a story of survival, of finding strength in the darkest places, and of learning that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. During lunch on Tuesday, Zara sat with Marcus and a small but growing group of friends they had attracted. Outcasts and misfits and former victims who had found in her story the courage to be themselves without apology. The conversation was light and easy, filled with genuine laughter and the kind of warmth that comes from being accepted exactly as you are. Across the cafeteria, she could see Trevor sitting alone at a table that had once been the exclusive domain of the popular crowd, picking at his food and avoiding everyone's gaze. The table that had once been the center of the school's social universe was now almost empty, its former occupants having distanced themselves from their fallen leader. For a moment, Zara almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then she remembered the cruelty in his voice when he had mocked her scar, the way he had used her deepest trauma as entertainment, and the sympathy faded as quickly as it had appeared. "You know," Marcus said quietly, leaning closer so only she could hear, "I've been thinking about what you said that day, about scars not making you weak." Zara looked at him with curious eyes, waiting for him to continue. "I think you're absolutely right," he said with conviction. "I think they make you stronger, more real, more human. They're proof that you survived something that tried to destroy you." "Some scars are visible," Zara said, unconsciously touching her cheek where the raised line caught the cafeteria's fluorescent lighting. "Others aren't. But we all have them, don't we?" "Yeah," Marcus agreed softly. "We do." As the bell rang and students began filing out of the cafeteria to their afternoon classes, Zara caught sight of Trevor one more time. He was walking alone through the crowded hallway, his shoulders slumped, his confident mask completely gone, looking more like a lost child than the imposing figure he had once been. She wondered if he had learned anything from their confrontation. If he understood now what it felt like to be powerless and afraid, or if he would simply find new, more subtle ways to make others feel small. But that wasn't her responsibility anymore, wasn't her burden to carry. She had spent too many years letting other people's cruelty define her world, too much time hiding from her own strength and potential. Now she was focused on building something better, something authentic, something that honored both her scars and her survival. Later that afternoon, as Zara walked through the student parking lot toward her father's old Honda, she noticed a younger student being cornered by a group of upperclassmen near the bike racks. The boy was small and obviously frightened, clutching his books to his chest like a shield, while the older students laughed and taunted him with the casual cruelty that seemed to be a universal language among bullies. For a moment, Zara hesitated, her steps slowing as she considered her options. Getting involved would mean drawing attention to herself again, risking the careful balance she had worked so hard to build since her confrontation with Trevor. It would mean stepping back into the spotlight, taking on responsibilities that weren't technically hers. But then she remembered Marcus's words about scars making you more human, about survival creating an obligation to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. She thought about her mother, who had always taught her that strength without compassion was just cruelty in disguise. And she knew, with absolute certainty, what she had to do. "Hey!" she called out, walking toward the group with confident strides that made several heads turn. "Is there a problem here?" The upperclassmen turned to look at her, and she saw the exact moment of recognition in their eyes, the widening pupils, the shift in posture, the sudden uncertainty that came from realizing they were facing someone who had already proven herself capable of violence. They had all seen the video, had all heard the stories, had all learned that the quiet girl in the hoodie was not someone to be underestimated. "No problem," one of them said quickly, his voice lacking conviction. "We were just talking to the kid about school spirit." "Good," Zara said, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel that made them all take an unconscious step backward. "Because I'd hate to think that Lincoln High hadn't learned anything from recent events. I'd hate to think that some people still needed to be reminded about treating others with basic human dignity." The group dispersed quickly, melting away into the general chaos of the parking lot like shadows at sunrise, leaving the younger student alone with Zara. He looked up at her with grateful eyes that shimmered with unshed tears of relief. and she saw something of herself in his frightened expression. The fear, the isolation, the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might care enough to help. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of car engines and slamming doors. "You're welcome," Zara replied gently. "What's your name?" "David," he said, straightening his shoulders slightly, as if her presence had given him some small measure of courage. "Well, David," Zara said with a smile that transformed her entire face, "here's some advice from someone who learned it the hard way. Don't let anyone make you feel smaller than you are. Don't let their cruelty define your worth or limit your potential. And if they try..." She paused, and for the first time since the accident, the scar on her face didn't feel like a mark of shame. Instead, it felt like a badge of honor, proof of what she had survived and overcome. "Well, let's just say you're not as alone as you think you are." As she walked away, leaving David standing straighter and looking stronger than he had moments before, Zara felt the weight of her transformation settling around her like a comfortable cloak. She had learned that strength wasn't about never being hurt. It was about what you chose to do with the hurt once you had it. It was about choosing to protect others instead of protecting only yourself, about understanding that the most powerful weapon against cruelty was not more cruelty, but the courage to stand up and say, "Enough." The scar would always be there, marking her face and her history like a permanent reminder of the night that had changed everything. But it no longer defined her or limited her possibilities. Instead, it was simply part of the story of who she had become. Someone who had been broken and had chosen to heal. Someone who had been made small and had chosen to stand tall. Someone who had learned that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones who look the most harmless. And in a world full of bullies and victims, predators and prey, Zara had chosen to be something else entirely. A protector, a survivor, and living proof that sometimes the quietest voices can roar the loudest when they finally decide to speak. She had learned that scars don't make you weak, they make you remember what you survived. And more importantly, they remind you of your obligation to help others survive as well. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as she reached her car, and for the first time in years, Zara felt truly at peace with who she was and who she was becoming. The frightened ghost who had haunted Lincoln High School's hallways was gone, replaced by someone stronger, braver, and more authentically herself than she had ever thought possible. And that, she realized, was worth every scar, every moment of pain, every second of the long journey that had brought her to this moment of understanding and acceptance.